Walter Johnson froze as flight attendant Heather Wilkins demanded he vacate his first-class seat. "These seats aren't for your kind," she whispered venomously. Little did she know, as the plane rumbled to a stop mid-takeoff, that the captain's salute would only be the beginning of her downfall. Before we dive into this powerful story of justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If this kind of disrespect makes your blood boil, hit that like button right now and subscribe to see more stories about unsung heroes finally getting the respect they deserve. Now let's get into what happened next. Walter Johnson had promised himself he would never set foot on an aircraft again. At 72 years old, the decorated Vietnam War veteran still carried the weight of that helicopter crash from 1968. The screams of his friends burning alive haunted his dreams 5 decades later. He could still smell the aviation fuel and jungle foliage, still feel the crushing weight of the wreckage pinning his leg as he dragged 3 men to safety before the explosion. "Dad, please." His daughter Amelia had begged over the phone last month. "Brandon has worked so hard for this. Graduating with honors from the Air Force Academy means everything to him." Walter rubbed his arthritic knee, the one that had never quite healed right after the crash. "I can drive," he insisted. 26 hours isn't too much. I'll stop overnight." "You're 72, Dad. Your doctor said long drives are bad for your circulation. Brandon wants his grandfather there and he wants you healthy." Walter stared at the faded photo on his mantle. 22-year-old Walter in uniform, arm thrown around his best friend Samuel, both grinning despite knowing what waited for them in the jungle. Samuel hadn't made it home. Neither had Reginald or Thomas or 14 others from their unit. "I promised them I'd never fly again," Walter whispered into the phone. Amelia's voice softened. "Dad, they wouldn't want you to miss this. They'd want you to be there for Brandon." His grandson had his mother's determination and Walter's stubbornness. The boy had overcome every obstacle to earn his place, despite the challenges that came with being a young black man pursuing a military career. Walter had taught him that serving your country didn't always mean your country would serve you back, but it was worth fighting for the America that could be. "I got you a first-class ticket," Amelia continued. "More legroom for your knee. A comfortable seat. Direct flight. 6 hours and you'll be here." After 3 sleepless nights, Walter had finally agreed. Now, standing in the crowded Atlanta airport terminal, he regretted that decision. The security line stretched endlessly. Despite his military ID, the TSA agent scrutinized his passport with suspicious eyes, asked him to step aside for random, additional screening while waving through white passengers behind him. "Arms out, sir," the agent commanded, waving the metal detector wand over Walter's body. His service medals jingled in his carry-on bag. Walter closed his eyes, remembering similar treatment when he'd returned from Vietnam. The country he'd bled, for still seeing his skin before his sacrifice. The whites-only signs might have disappeared, but the attitudes lingered like smoke damage after a fire. "Got somewhere important to be?" the TSA agent asked, taking his time examining Walter's cane. "My grandson's graduation," Walter replied simply. "Air Force." Something flickered in the agent's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. He handed back the cane, without comment. Walter limped toward his gate, clutching his boarding pass. Gate A23. First class. Seat 3A. A gift he'd never asked for but appreciated more than his daughter knew. His arthritic knee throbbed with every step. The painkillers he'd taken earlier barely took the edge off. At the gate, Walter found a quiet corner seat and closed his eyes, performing the ritual that had gotten him through countless dangerous missions. He breathed deeply, picturing Brandon's face. The boy's smile, so like his grandmother's, his determination, his future. For Brandon, he could face this fear. For Brandon, he could board that metal tube and trust it to carry him safely through the sky. "Now boarding our first-class passengers for Transcontinental Airlines Flight 247 to Colorado Springs," the gate agent announced. Walter gripped his cane and boarding pass, said a silent prayer to Samuel and all the others who never made it home, and stepped forward. For Brandon, he would fly again after 40 years with his feet planted firmly on the ground. The jetway stretched before him like the mouth of some mechanical beast. Each step forward tightened the vise around his chest. By the time he reached the aircraft door, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant greeted, her smile dimming slightly as she took in Walter's appearance. His suit was well worn, but dignified, a relic from his days as a high school history teacher before retirement. Walter nodded politely and stepped into the cabin. First class, 12 spacious seats, 10 already occupied by businessmen in expensive suits, a woman typing furiously on a MacBook, and an older white couple who looked up briefly as he entered. Seat 3A, window seat, left side. Walter checked his boarding pass twice before carefully stowing his small bag in the overhead compartment. His movements were methodical, deliberate, masking the trembling in his hands. As he lowered himself into the plush seat, a flash of memory hit him. The helicopter seat had been canvas, utilitarian, nothing like this luxury. Yet the confined space triggered the same panic. Walter closed his eyes and breathed deeply, focusing on the soft leather beneath his fingers. Different texture, different time, different purpose. "Excuse me," came a female voice. Walter opened his eyes to find a middle-aged white woman in a business suit standing in the aisle. "I believe I'm in 3B. "Ma'am." Walter nodded, making no move to stand. His knee needed time between transitions. The woman, Claire Donovan, hesitated before taking her seat beside him. Walter noticed how she shifted slightly toward the aisle, creating an invisible barrier between them. He'd seen it countless times before. The subtle body language of discomfort. He turned toward the window, gazing at the airport workers loading luggage into the belly of the aircraft, wondering if Brandon would be proud or ashamed of his decision to endure this journey and all its indignities. The first sign of trouble came during the pre-flight beverage service. Flight attendant Heather Wilkins moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her makeup impeccable. "Good morning, sir. What can I get you before takeoff?" she asked the businessman across the aisle. "Sparkling water with lime, please," he replied without looking up from his laptop. "Of course." Heather served him with a flourish before turning to the couple in row 2. "And for you today?" "Mimosa for me," the woman answered. "Coffee black for my husband." Heather worked her way through the cabin, offering drinks to each passenger. When she reached Claire Donovan in 3B, she smiled warmly. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" "Just water, please," Claire responded, glancing briefly at Walter before returning to her phone. Heather placed a napkin on Claire's tray table, set down the water, and then stepped back, turning toward the next row without acknowledging Walter. Walter cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me, miss." Heather's smile tightened as she half-turned. "I'll be right with you," she said dismissively before continuing to the passengers behind. Walter sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, watching as every other first-class passenger received their pre-flight beverage. When Heather passed by again, he tried once more. "Pardon me, miss. Could I get some water, please?" Heather paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We're preparing for departure. Seatbelt sign is about to come on." Walter nodded toward the other passengers, all enjoying their drinks. "I understand. Just water would be fine." Heather's smile never reached her eyes. "I'll see what I can do." She never returned with his water. Walter wasn't surprised. As the son of a janitor who had grown up in segregated Alabama, he'd faced far worse than being denied a beverage. Still, the familiar sting of humiliation burned in his chest. 40 years since he'd worn his country's uniform in a foreign jungle and still fighting for basic dignity at home. The flight attendant's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Claire Donovan glanced uncomfortably between Walter and her own water glass. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Heather Wilkins had worked for Transcontinental Airlines for 11 years. The daughter of a regional vice president for a competing airline, she'd grown up in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, attending private schools before a brief stint at a liberal arts college. Her father's connections had secured her position despite mediocre training scores. Over the years, 5 formal complaints had been filed against her for discriminatory behavior. All had been quietly dismissed, thanks to her friendship with the Airlines regional manager Richard Keller. They played tennis together at the same country club. His daughter babysat for her kids. Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for departure. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are up, and seats are in their upright position, came the announcement over the intercom. Walter secured his seatbelt and closed his eyes, reciting a silent prayer for safety. The engines rumbled beneath them, and sweat beaded on his forehead as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. That's when Heather returned, standing over him with a clipboard. "Sir, it appears there's been a mistake with your seating assignment." Walter opened his eyes. "Pardon me? This flight is overbooked in first class. I need you to relocate to economy." Her voice was professional but cold, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Walter reached for his boarding pass in his jacket pocket. "There must be some misunderstanding. My ticket is for seat 3A. Heather's smile tightened. "Yes, there was a computer error. We need this seat for another passenger. I can show you to economy." Walter glanced around. Every seat in first class was occupied except for one, 5C, at the back of the cabin. "That seat there is empty," he pointed out. "It's reserved," Heather replied quickly. "There's a deadheading crew member joining us." Walter had flown enough in his military days to know airline terminology. Deadheading meant an off-duty crew member traveling to another location, but something in Heather's tone told him this was a fabrication. "I paid for this seat," he said quietly. "My daughter purchased it specifically because of my medical condition." He gestured discreetly toward his knee. Heather's expression hardened. "Sir, I need you to comply with crew member instructions. It's a federal requirement." Around them, other passengers began to take notice. Some studiously looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others watched with open curiosity. "Is there a problem here?" Claire Donovan asked, finally finding her voice. "No problem," Heather replied sharply. "Just a seating adjustment." Walter felt 40 pairs of eyes on him. The familiar weight of judgment, the pressure to comply, to not make a scene. The same pressure he'd felt at lunch counters and bus stations and job interviews throughout his life. "May I speak with the captain?" Walter asked, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Heather's nostrils flared slightly. "The captain is preparing for takeoff. This isn't negotiable. Either move to economy, or I'll be forced to have you removed from the flight." The whispers began immediately. A businessman across the aisle muttered, "Something about these people always causing problems." An older woman in row 4 shook her head disapprovingly. Walter felt the walls closing in. Missing Brandon's graduation would break the boy's heart. Making a scene might mean being banned from flying altogether. "These seats aren't for your kind," Heather whispered venomously, leaning close so only Walter could hear. "First class means first-class citizens." The words hit Walter like physical blows. He'd heard similar sentiments throughout his 72 years, from elementary school teachers, from military commanders despite his exemplary service, from bank loan officers and restaurant hosts and real estate agents. He thought of the medals in his carry-on, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the Commendation, from President Nixon himself. None of it mattered to this woman who saw only his skin. "You need to move now," Heather insisted, her voice rising, "or I'll have security escort you off." Walter slowly reached for his cane, dignity intact despite the humiliation burning through him. He'd survived war. He'd survived this too. "I have my orders," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. As Walter Johnson gathered his carry-on bag, leaning heavily on his cane to stand, the ripple effect of the confrontation spread throughout the first-class cabin. Some passengers stared out windows or at screens, pretending not to notice the unfolding injustice. Others whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting between Walter and Heather. Claire Donovan shifted uncomfortably in seat 3B. The marketing executive had spent 20 years climbing corporate ladders, learning when to speak up and when to remain silent. This moment challenged everything about her carefully constructed, professional persona. "This isn't right," she thought, watching Walter's weathered hands trembling slightly as he collected his belongings. The wedding ring he still wore despite being widowed for 12 years. The way he maintained his dignity despite the public humiliation. 3 rows back, College student Tyler Rodriguez had already captured 5 minutes of the interaction on his smartphone. The 20-year-old journalism major recognized a story unfolding before his eyes. "You don't have to move, sir," Tyler called out, his phone still recording. "Your ticket gives you the right to that seat." Heather shot him a warning glance. "Please stay out of this. Airline seating is at the discretion of the crew." "Is it also at your discretion who gets pre-flight beverages?" Tyler challenged. "I noticed he was the only person in first class you didn't serve." Air Marshal David Chen observed silently from seat 4D. Dressed in civilian clothes, he monitored the escalating situation, noting Heather's body language and tone. After 20 years with the Federal Air Marshal Service, he recognized the difference between legitimate security concerns and personal prejudice. From the last row of first class, an elderly white woman with a crown of silver hair slowly stood up. Barbara Williams, 78, gripped the seats for support as she made her way forward. "Young lady," she addressed Heather, her Southern accent thick with disapproval. "I was a teacher in Mississippi during integration. I recognize discrimination when I see it." Heather's professional smile faltered. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're preparing for takeoff." "I marched with Dr. King," Barbara continued undeterred. "I've seen this before. Different decade, same hatred." The cabin grew unnaturally quiet as passengers processed this public call-out. Walter stood frozen in the aisle, caught between humiliation and unexpected support. "Is this how Transcontinental Airlines treats its passengers?" called a man in a business suit. "Based on their appearance?" "I paid for this seat," Walter repeated quietly. "My daughter bought it because of my medical condition." He gestured toward his injured knee, a souvenir from his service. "Sir, you need to move now," Heather insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "We can't delay takeoff." Walter took a painful step toward the economy section, the weight of decades of similar indignities pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of a diner in Alabama, 1969. Just back from Vietnam, still in uniform, medals displayed proudly on his chest. The owner had refused to serve him, had called the police when Walter pointed out the "We Serve Military Personnel" sign in the window. "Not your kind of military," the owner had said. Now, 53 years later, the same scene played out at 30,000 feet. "Wait," Claire Donovan finally spoke up, unable to remain silent any longer. "This is wrong. He has a valid ticket for this seat." "It's a computer error," Heather insisted, her cheeks flushing. "Show me," Claire challenged. "Show me the manifestee. That says he doesn't belong in this seat." Heather's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That's confidential airline information." Tyler Rodriguez continued filming, narrating quietly into his phone. Transcontinental Airlines flight attendant, attempting to remove elderly black veteran from his paid first-class seat. Multiple witnesses now intervening. With trembling hands, he uploaded the first video clip to social media, tagging the airline, veterans groups, and civil rights organizations. Within minutes, the view count climbed. 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. The aircraft continued taxiing toward the runway, the engines growing louder as the confrontation escalated. Heather reached for the cabin phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I need security to meet this flight upon return to gate. Passenger refusing crew instructions in first class." "That's a lie," Barbara Williams called out. "We all see. What's happening here?" Walter stood silently in the aisle, caught in a situation spiraling beyond his control. He'd faced artillery fire with less anxiety than this public spectacle. His knee throbbed painfully, and the memories of similar confrontations throughout his life flashed through his mind. The plane continued its inexorable movement toward the runway. The moment for security intervention passed. Walter remained, standing, unsure whether to return to his seat or accept the humiliation and move to economy. Heather pointed toward the back of the plane. "Sir, take any available seat in economy, now." The aircraft joined the takeoff queue, second in line. In moments, they would be hurtling down the runway, and Walter would be forced to stand through acceleration or hurriedly take whatever seat was available, his dignity in tatters either way. Are you as furious as I am watching this scene unfold? Comment number 1 if you believe Heather should be fired immediately for this blatant discrimination. Comment number 2 if you think the other passengers should have stood up sooner. Hit that like button if you're proud of Tyler for documenting this injustice and Barbara for speaking up. Subscribe to see more stories about everyday heroes standing against discrimination. But what happens when the pilot discovers what's happening in the cabin? And how is the revelation about to change everything? Keep watching to find out. In the cockpit of Flight 247, First Officer Michael Peterson frowned as he completed the pre-takeoff checklist. Through the partially open cockpit door, he had noticed unusual movement in the first-class cabin. "Something's going on back there," he mentioned to Captain James Richardson, a 30-year veteran with Transcontinental Airlines. Captain Richardson, focused on communications with the tower, barely glanced up. "Probably late boarding. Weather system moving in. Tower wants us. Airborne in the next 10 minutes. At 60 years old, James Richardson had seen nearly everything during his career. Beginning as a military pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation, he prided himself on punctuality and professionalism. His close-cropped salt and pepper, hair and commanding presence earned him respect from crew and passengers alike. "Runway 29er clear for takeoff," came the controller's voice through their headsets. "Roger that. Transcontinental 247 beginning takeoff roll," Richardson responded, easing the throttle forward. In the main cabin, Flight attendant Sophia Cruz watched the confrontation with growing discomfort. Unlike Heather, who worked exclusively in first class, Sophia rotated throughout the aircraft. 28 years old and only 2 years into her career with Transcontinental, she feared challenging her senior colleague. "Heather," Sophia whispered urgently, approaching as the plane began to move faster. "The gentleman needs to be seated for takeoff." Heather turned, irritation flashing across her face. He refused his reassignment. "But there was no reassignment in the system," Sophia replied, confused. "I checked the manifest. Seat 3A belongs to Walter Johnson." "Stay out of this," Heather hissed. "Handle the main cabin." The aircraft accelerated, forcing Walter to grab a seat back for stability. His arthritic knee nearly buckled as the plane gathered speed. At the same moment, Air Marshal Chen decided the situation warranted intervention. He rose smoothly from his seat, badge already in hand. "Sir," he addressed Walter, "please return to your assigned seat immediately for safety." Then, turning to Heather, "Flight attendant, we'll address any seating discrepancies after reaching cruising altitude." Heather's eyes widened at the sight of the federal badge. "You don't understand. There's a security concern." "The only security concern I see is a passenger being forced to stand during takeoff," Chen interrupted. "That violates federal safety regulations." The aircraft continued accelerating down the runway, approaching 100 knots. Walter carefully lowered himself back into seat 3A, his face a mask of controlled emotion. In the rear of first class, Sophia Cruz made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career. She lifted the cabin phone and dialed the cockpit. "Captain, this is Sophia in main cabin," she said quietly. "We have a situation in first class involving passenger discrimination. Flight attendant Wilkins attempted to remove an elderly black veteran from his assigned seat without cause." Captain Richardson, focused on the critical takeoff sequence, registered only fragments of this information. "Handle it at cruise," he replied automatically, eyes on his instruments. "Sir," Sophia continued, her voice shaking. "The passenger's name is Walter Johnson. He's a Vietnam veteran traveling to his grandson's Air Force graduation." Something about the name triggered a memory in James Richardson's mind. Walter Johnson. The name echoed from decades past, from another life, from the jungle. "Repeat that name," he demanded, even as the aircraft reached rotation speed. "Walter Johnson, sir, seat 3A." The world seemed to slow around Captain Richardson as 35-year-old memories crystallized. Walter Johnson. Staff Sergeant Walter Johnson. The man who had pulled him from burning helicopter wreckage in 1968, who had carried him 3 miles through enemy territory with a shattered leg of his own. The man who had saved 14 lives that day, including his own. The man who had received the Medal of Honor from President Nixon while Richardson watched from a wheelchair, his brother in arms. The aircraft lifted off the runway, climbing through 100 feet, 200. Standard procedure demanded absolute focus during this critical phase of flight. James Richardson had never deviated from standard procedure in 30 years of commercial flying, until now. Tower, Transcontinental 247, requesting immediate return to taxiway due to cabin emergency, he announced, his decision already made. Transcontinental 247, confirm emergency nature. The controller responded, surprise evident in his voice. Potential security situation requiring ground intervention, Richardson replied, using terminology that would trigger immediate response. Understood. Cleared to abort takeoff sequence. Return to taxiway Charlie, hold position. First Officer Peterson stared in shock as Richardson reduced throttle and initiated the uncommon maneuver. Captain, what's happening? Walter Johnson is on this aircraft, Richardson said, his voice tight with emotion, and someone is denying him the respect he's earned. The sudden deceleration threw passengers forward against their seatbelts. Gasps and cries of alarm spread through the cabin as the aircraft, rather than continuing its climb, leveled off at 400 feet and began a gentle turn back toward the airport. Ladies and gentlemen, First Officer Peterson announced over the intercom, following emergency protocols. Remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're returning to the taxiway for a brief technical check. In first class, confusion. Reigned. Tyler Rodriguez continued filming as the aircraft completed its unusual maneuver, his journalism instincts telling him something unprecedented was unfolding. The plane's turning around, he narrated into his phone. Something's happening. Heather grabbed the cabin phone, her face flushed with anger and fear. Captain, why are we returning to the taxiway? We have a schedule to maintain. Secure the cabin, Ms. Wilkins, came Richardson's curt reply. I'm coming out. As the aircraft settled onto the taxiway, the cockpit door opened. Captain James Richardson emerged, his uniform impeccable, his bearing military precise despite his 60 years. The cabin fell silent as he surveyed the first class section, his eyes finally settling on the elderly black man in seat 3A. Walter Johnson looked up, confusion giving way to shock as recognition dawned in his eyes. Jimmy Richardson? Walter whispered, his voice barely audible. The captain's weathered face broke into a smile that erased decades. Staff Sergeant Johnson, he replied. It's been a long time. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute as Captain James Richardson stood in the aisle, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Some passengers clutched armrests nervously, conditioned by years of post-9/11 air travel to fear any deviation from routine. Is this a security threat? A businessman asked anxiously. Are we in danger? Richardson shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Walter Johnson's face. No threat. Just a grave injustice I needed to address personally. Walter stared back, decades falling away as he recognized the young lieutenant he'd pulled from burning wreckage 35 years earlier. The boy had been 25 then, his legs crushed in the helicopter crash, screaming for his mother as Walter dragged him to safety through enemy gunfire. Now that boy stood before him as a 60-year-old airline captain, the years mapped in, the lines of his face but the eyes unchanged. Ladies and gentlemen, Richardson addressed the cabin, his voice carrying the authority of both his captain's rank and his military background. I apologize for the unexpected maneuver, but I couldn't continue this flight under the current circumstances. He took 3 measured steps toward Walter's seat, his posture military straight despite the low cabin ceiling. This man, Richardson continued, gesturing toward Walter, is Staff Sergeant Walter Johnson, United States Army Vietnam, recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. Murmurs spread through the cabin as the significance registered. Tyler Rodriguez's live stream counter ticked rapidly upward, 250,000 viewers now watching the scene unfold in real time. On April 16, 1968, our helicopter was shot down behind enemy lines. The fuel tank exploded on impact. I was pinned in the wreckage, my legs crushed. Richardson's voice remained steady, but emotion burned beneath the professional veneer. Staff Sergeant Johnson, despite being injured himself, returned to that burning helicopter 3 times, pulling survivors to safety, before dragging 14 of us through the jungle to evacuation coordinates. Walter's eyes glistened with unshed tears as the memories flooded back. The heat of the flames, the smell of burning metal and flesh, the weight of the wounded men, the constant fear of enemy patrols. He carried me on his back for 3 miles, Richardson continued. His own leg torn open to the bone from shrapnel. He refused evacuation until every man was accounted for. Heather Wilkins stood frozen, her face draining of color as she realized the magnitude of her error. 14 families still have fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers because of this man's courage, Richardson said, his voice rising with controlled emotion. I have lived 47 years, had 3 children and 5 grandchildren because Walter Johnson valued my life above his own safety. The captain turned to face Heather directly. And you tried to remove him from his rightful seat? Denied him basic courtesy? Humiliated him in front of other passengers? Heather's mouth opened and closed without sound, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Richardson turned back to Walter, and in a move that left the cabin breathless, stood at attention and offered a formal military salute. Staff Sergeant Johnson, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It has been my honor to wait 47 years to return this salute. Walter struggled to his feet, his arthritic knee protesting, his back straightening as decades of military discipline returned to his body. He returned the salute crisply, his weathered hand steady at his brow. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause, led by Barbara Williams, whose tears flowed freely down her lined cheeks. Even the most detached business travelers set aside their laptops to acknowledge the moment unfolding before them. Ladies and gentlemen, Richardson addressed the cabin once the applause subsided. Staff Sergeant Johnson is traveling to Colorado Springs to see his grandson graduate from the Air Force Academy with honors, the next generation of his family continuing a legacy of service. He turned to Heather, his expression hardening. Ms. Wilkins, you are relieved of duty on this flight. Please gather your belongings and report to the chief purser at the terminal. Captain, I didn't know, Heather began. That's precisely the problem, Richardson interrupted. You didn't need to know he was a hero to treat him with basic human dignity. Sophia Cruz stepped forward. I'll take over the first-class service, Captain. Richardson nodded his approval. Ms. Cruz, please ensure Staff Sergeant Johnson receives the comfort and respect his ticket entitles him to, and that his service to this country deserves. Tyler Rodriguez's live stream counter hit 1 million viewers as he captured Sophia, escorting Walter back to his first-class seat with a level of deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Claire Donovan wiped tears from her cheeks. Sir, she addressed Walter, I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. My silence made me complicit. I hope you can forgive me. Walter settled back into his seat, the dignity that had momentarily been stripped from him restored and amplified. Nothing to forgive, young lady. We all have our moments to choose courage. Barbara Williams made her way forward, her arthritic hands trembling with emotion. During the Freedom Rides in '61, I learned that speaking up isn't enough if you wait too long, but it's never too late to stand on the right side. Walter smiled at the elderly white woman, recognizing a fellow traveler on the long road toward justice. Progress comes one person at a time, one moment at a time. The passengers who had studiously ignored the initial confrontation now couldn't look away from Walter. The businessman who had muttered complaints earlier approached hesitantly. Sir, I served in Desert Storm, he said quietly. It was because of men like you that we were treated with respect when we returned. I failed to offer you the same consideration. Please accept my apology. As Sophia served Walter the first-class meal he'd paid for, Captain Richardson returned to the cockpit to prepare for their delayed departure. Before closing the door, he turned back to the cabin. This American hero flies first class on my plane, he announced, or we don't fly at all. The cabin erupted in applause once more as Walter Johnson sat in his rightful seat, his eyes glistening with emotion, his hands steady on the armrests as the aircraft prepared for its second attempt at takeoff. While Flight 247 taxied back toward the runway for its second takeoff attempt, The video of Walter Johnson's humiliation and vindication blazed across the internet like wildfire. Tyler Rodriguez's livestream had captured everything, from Heather's initial discrimination to Captain Richardson's dramatic intervention and salute. In the executive offices of Transcontinental Airlines headquarters in Dallas, emergency notifications buzzed on multiple devices simultaneously. CEO Victoria Hamilton was midway through a quarterly board meeting when her chief of communications burst through the door, face ashen. "We have a situation," he announced without preamble, turning his tablet to display Tyler's viral video, already at 3 million views and climbing exponentially. Victoria, a 54-year-old former Air Force pilot herself, watched 30 seconds of the clip before rising to her feet. "Meeting adjourned," she announced to the startled board members. "This takes priority." Within minutes, Victoria had assembled her crisis management team in the executive conference room. The video played on the large screen as executives watched in horrified silence. "That's a Medal of Honor recipient," Victoria said through clenched teeth when the video ended. "Being denied service and humiliated on one of our aircraft. The captain violated protocol by returning to the taxiway," the chief of operations pointed out. Victoria fixed him with an icy stare. "Captain Richardson is the only person in this scenario who acted with integrity. I want him commended, not reprimanded." She turned to her communications director. "Draft a statement immediately, full apology, zero excuses. Announce Heather Wilkins's termination and a comprehensive review of our diversity training protocols." Back at Atlanta International Airport, airport police were already waiting at Gate A23 when Flight 247 returned to the terminal. They weren't there for Walter Johnson, however. "Ms. Wilkins," the lead officer said as Heather exited the jetway, escorted by airport staff. "We need to speak with you regarding a potential civil rights violation." Heather's face crumpled as she spotted the news vans already gathering outside the terminal windows. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "I was following company policy about upgraded passengers." "The company has no such policy," said a stern-faced Transcontinental Airlines regional director who had rushed to the scene. "And we've received your termination paperwork directly from the CEO." Inside the terminal, Walter Johnson's phone rang incessantly. His daughter Amelia had seen the video and was frantically trying to reach him. "Dad!" she cried, when he finally answered. "Are you okay? It's all over the news." "I'm fine, baby girl," Walter assured her, his voice steady despite the emotional turbulence of the past hour. "Just a misunderstanding that got cleared up." "Misunderstanding?" Amelia's voice rose in indignation. "That woman tried to humiliate you because of your race. And Captain Richardson, is it really the same James Richardson you saved in Vietnam?" "One and the same," Walter confirmed, watching through the terminal window as Richardson spoke with airline officials gesturing emphatically, "Still standing up for what's right after all these years." As Walter waited in the first-class lounge, access insisted upon by the apologetic regional director, a parade of passengers from Flight 247 approached to shake his hand, request photos, and offer apologies for not intervening sooner. Claire Donovan pressed her business card into his palm. "My company has a foundation that supports veterans' causes," she told him. "I'd be honored if you'd speak at our next benefit." Barbara Williams settled into the chair beside him, her arthritis making her movements slow but deliberate. "In 1963, I stood at the Lincoln Memorial and heard Dr. King speak of his dream," she said quietly. "We've come so far, and yet moments like today remind us how far we still have to go." Outside the first-class lounge, Transcontinental employees huddled around smartphones and tablets, watching the viral video with expressions ranging from horror to outrage. Sophia Cruz found herself surrounded by colleagues praising her courage in alerting the captain. "I was just doing what's right," she insisted, uncomfortable with the attention. "You risked your job," another flight attendant pointed out. "Heather's family has connections. Her father is VP at Continental Express." "Some things matter more than job security," Sophia replied, her voice steady with conviction. Meanwhile, the internet did what it does best. It investigated. Within hours, former passengers and colleagues began sharing their own experiences with Heather Wilkins. A black executive recounted being repeatedly ignored during a first-class flight while white passengers received prompt service. A Latino family described being questioned about their first-class tickets despite having proper boarding passes. Each new story added fuel to the firestorm engulfing transcontinental airlines. Victoria Hamilton, watching the situation deteriorate by the minute, made an unprecedented decision. "Prepare the corporate jet," she instructed her assistant. "I'm flying to Atlanta immediately." Captain Richardson, having declined the airline's offer to replace him on Flight 247, stood firm in his decision to continue piloting the flight to Colorado Springs. "My passengers trust me to get them to their destination," he stated simply, "and Staff Sergeant Johnson's grandson is expecting him at graduation tomorrow." Walter, seated in the lounge watching the commotion unfold around him, considered quietly. Booking a different flight to avoid further attention. The media presence was growing by the minute, and the last thing he wanted was to become the center of a national conversation about race. "You're thinking of disappearing, aren't you?" Captain Richardson asked, settling into the chair across from Walter. After 47 years, he could still read his former staff sergeant's expression. Walter smiled ruefully. "You know me too." "Well, Lieutenant, still not comfortable in the spotlight." "Don't let them win again, brother," Richardson said quietly. "Not after all these years. Your grandson deserves to see you arrive with honor, not skulking in through the back door because some bigot tried to put you in your place." Walter considered his old friend's words, turning his gaze to the terminal where Heather Wilkins was being escorted to a private security office, her face hidden behind large sunglasses, despite being indoors. Before Walter could respond, the lounge door opened to admit a striking woman in her 50s, wearing an impeccable suit and a Transcontinental Airlines executive badge. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," Victoria Hamilton said, approaching with her hand extended. "I'm Victoria Hamilton, CEO of Transcontinental. I served 20 years in the Air Force before joining the private sector. It is my profound honor to meet you, and my deepest shame that you were treated so disrespectfully on one of our aircraft." Walter accepted her handshake, noting the firmness of her grip and the sincerity in her eyes. "I've come personally to apologize on behalf of the entire company," Victoria continued. "What happened today represents the actions of one individual, not our values. But it also highlights failures in our training and culture that I take full responsibility for addressing." As Victoria spoke with Walter, Heather Wilkins sat in a security office, her attorney father on speakerphone. "This is outrageous," Harold Wilkins fumed. "They can't fire you over a simple misunderstanding. I'll have the airline in court by morning." "Dad," Heather interrupted, her voice hollow. "There's video. Millions of people have seen it." "So what? You were enforcing company policy about appropriate first-class attire and behavior. We'll countersue for defamation." Heather stared at her reflection in the office window, barely recognizing the person she had become. "He has a Medal of Honor, Dad. I tried to make him give up his seat because of his race." "Never admit that," Harold shouted, through the phone. "We'll say it was about his clothing, his behavior, anything but race. I know people who can make this go away." As Harold Wilkins plotted his daughter's defense, unaware that her body-worn microphone had captured her "These seats aren't for your kind" comment clearly on Tyler's video, Walter Johnson and James Richardson prepared to reboard Flight 247, now 3 hours behind schedule. Victoria Hamilton walked them to the gate personally, a phalanx of airline executives in her wake. "Your flight has been fully refunded," she informed Walter, "and we'd like to offer you lifetime first-class travel on any transcontinental route." Walter shook his head gently. "Ms. Hamilton, I appreciate the gesture, but I didn't do what I did in Vietnam for rewards, and I don't want special treatment now because of what happened today. Just treat everyone with the same respect and dignity, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Victoria nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. "Then consider it a standing invitation, Mr. Johnson. Available whenever you choose to accept it." As Walter and James walked down the jetway together, their shared history bridging nearly 5 decades, Walter realized that the ripples from today's confrontation would spread far beyond this flight, or even this airline. Some changes take a lifetime. Some take a moment of courage. Sometimes, The most powerful statement is simply claiming the seat you've rightfully earned and refusing to be moved. Have you ever witnessed discrimination but been afraid to speak up? Comment number 1. If you've been in Claire's position, wanting to help but hesitating. Comment number 2 if you've been brave like Tyler and Barbara, standing up despite the risks. Like this video if you believe Captain Richardson's actions show what true leadership looks like. Subscribe to see more stories of everyday heroes changing the world, one courageous act at a time. But what happens when Walter finally arrives at his grandson's graduation? And how will the media storm transform his quiet life? Keep watching to find out. Flight 247 cruised at 35,000 feet, its journey delayed but finally underway. In the cockpit, Captain James Richardson maintained his professional focus despite the emotional turbulence of the past few hours. First Officer Peterson occasionally glanced at his captain with newfound respect, having witnessed his stand against injustice. "You risked your career back there," Peterson commented during a quiet moment. Richardson adjusted a control with practiced precision. "Some things matter more than careers. I waited 47 years to repay a debt I owe that man. I'd have given up more than a job to do it." In the first-class cabin, Walter Johnson sat in his rightful seat, the center of a transformed atmosphere. Sophia Cruz attended to his needs, with a level of service that bordered on reverence, ensuring his water glass never emptied, offering extra pillows for his arthritic knee, checking frequently for his comfort. Claire Donovan, in seat 3B, had abandoned all pretense of working on her laptop. Instead, she engaged Walter in conversation, listening intently as he shared stories of his years as a history teacher after leaving military service. "I taught American history for 30 years, Walter explained. "Tried to help young people understand both the promise of our founding documents and how often we've failed to live up to those ideals." "Did your students know about your Medal of Honor?" Claire asked. Walter smiled softly. "I never mentioned it. Didn't want them thinking history was only about battles and medals. Wanted them to understand that ordinary people shape history through daily choices about justice and dignity." Tyler Rodriguez, having been upgraded to first class at the insistence of the airline's regional director, continued documenting the journey. His initial video had surpassed 20 million views within 3 hours, spawning thousands of reaction videos, commentary pieces, and news segments. "Mr. Johnson," he said, approaching Walter's seat cautiously. "CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News have all reached out through my social channels. They want to interview you when we land." Walter shook his head. "This isn't about me, son. It's about something bigger." "That's exactly why people need to hear from you," Tyler countered respectfully. "You've lived through so much history. Your perspective matters." While Flight 247 traversed the country, the media landscape below erupted in a feeding frenzy. Cable news networks ran the footage on continuous loops. Commentators debated the broader implications for race relations, veterans affairs, and corporate responsibility. Transcontinental Airlines' social media team worked frantically to address the tsunami of comments flooding their channels. CEO Victoria Hamilton, having returned to headquarters, approved a comprehensive statement that acknowledged the incident without equivocation, announced Heather Wilkins' termination, and outlined immediate steps to address systemic issues. The statement concluded, "Today we failed not only Mr. Johnson but our own stated values. We are grateful for the courage of those who spoke up, and we commit to ensuring this never happens again on our aircraft." Archive footage from 1968 surfaced on news broadcasts. Grainy film showing a young Walter Johnson ramrod straight in, his dress uniform, receiving the Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon. The citation read aloud detailed his extraordinary heroism in rescuing 14 comrades from a burning helicopter while under enemy fire, despite his own severe injuries. Veterans organizations mobilized rapidly. The American Legion, VFW, and disabled American veterans issued joint statements condemning the treatment of Walter Johnson and calling for greater awareness of discrimination faced by veterans of color. At Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, Airman First Class Brandon Johnson watched the unfolding story in stunned silence, surrounded by fellow cadets in the common room. His grandfather, the quiet, dignified man who had taught him about service and sacrifice, was suddenly at the center of a national conversation. "That's your grandfather?" His roommate asked incredulously. The Medal of Honor recipient? Brandon nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He never talks about it. Never wanted special treatment or recognition. Base Commander Colonel Teresa Alvarez entered the room, approaching Brandon with purpose. Airman Johnson, in light of today's events, we'd like to arrange special recognition for your grandfather at tomorrow's ceremony. With your permission, of course. Meanwhile, back on Flight 247, Walter dozed fitfully, decades of memories washing. Over him in waves, the helicopter crash, the searing heat of napalm, the weight of Lieutenant Richardson across his shoulders as he navigated hostile territory. The years of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination upon his return. The pride of watching his daughter graduate college, the first in their family, the birth of his grandson Brandon. He awoke to find James Richardson seated beside him, having turned over the controls to his first officer during a quiet stretch of flight. Lot of attention waiting for you on the ground, Walt, Richardson said quietly. Media, military brass, probably some politicians looking for a photo op. Walter sighed heavily. Never wanted to be a symbol or a cause. Just wanted to serve my country, raise my family, live with dignity. Richardson nodded understanding. Sometimes we don't choose our battles. Sometimes the battle chooses us. On the ground, the story continued expanding in unexpected directions. Former colleagues of Heather Wilkins came forward with accounts of previous discriminatory behavior that had gone unaddressed. 3 former passengers provided evidence of formal complaints they'd filed that had been dismissed by the airline. Heather herself had retreated to her father's Connecticut estate, surrounded by family and legal advisors. Harold Wilkins, a powerful figure in aviation circles, had already begun calling in favors to manage his daughter's crisis. We'll position you as the victim here, he insisted, pacing the marble floors of his study. Canceled by the woke mob, trial by social media. But even Harold Wilkins' considerable influence couldn't stem the tide of public opinion. The clear video evidence, Walter Johnson's impeccable record, and Captain Richardson's dramatic intervention created a perfect storm that swept away attempts at misdirection. Transcontinental Airlines' stock price dropped 11% by market close, prompting emergency board discussions about additional response measures. Victoria Hamilton proposed comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all customer-facing staff with specific modules addressing unconscious bias and the dignity of military veterans. This isn't just a PR problem, she argued forcefully. It's a moral failing we need to address systemically. As Flight 247 began its descent into Colorado Springs, Walter gazed out the window at the Rocky Mountains rising majestically in the distance. He had fought for this country, bled for it, devoted his life to teaching its history to young people. And now, in his 8th decade, he found himself at the center of another chapter in America's long, painful journey toward fulfilling its founding promise. Sophia Cruz approached with a satellite phone. Mr. Johnson, your daughter Amelia is calling. She says it's urgent. Walter accepted the phone with a nod of thanks. Amelia, everything okay, sweetheart? His daughter's voice crackled through the connection. Dad, you need to be prepared. There's a huge crowd waiting at the airport. News vans, military personnel, hundreds of veterans. Someone organized an impromptu honor guard. Walter closed, his eyes overwhelmed by the thought. I just want to see Brandon graduate, baby girl. Don't want to be a spectacle. I know, Dad, Amelia replied softly. But maybe this isn't just about you. Maybe it's about all the other Walter Johnsons who never got their moment of recognition. Maybe it's about Brandon and his generation seeing that sometimes justice does prevail. As the aircraft touched down in Colorado Springs, Walter looked out the window to see exactly what Amelia had described. Hundreds of people lining the tarmac, many in military uniforms, others holding signs of support. American flags fluttered in the mountain breeze. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Richardson announced over the intercom as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. It has been my profound honor to fly with true American hero, Staff Sergeant Walter Johnson today. As we prepare to deplane, I ask that you allow Mr. Johnson to exit first, accompanied by our crew. The passengers burst into spontaneous applause that continued unabated as Walter, leaning on his cane but walking tall, made his way toward the aircraft door. Sometimes dignity delayed is not dignity denied. Sometimes justice arrives late, but arrives nonetheless. Sometimes a seat on an airplane becomes a symbol of something much larger than first-class comfort. It becomes a stand for human dignity itself. The jetway at Colorado Springs Airport had never witnessed anything like the procession that emerged from Flight 247. Walter Johnson walked slowly but proudly, his arthritic knee stiff after the flight, despite the comfort of first class. Captain James Richardson accompanied him in full uniform, matching his pace to Walter's measured steps. Behind them followed Sophia Cruz and the entire flight crew, their professional composure softened by the emotion of the moment. As Walter emerged into the terminal, the waiting crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Veterans in uniform spanning conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan stood at attention, rendering crisp salutes. Civilians pressed forward, smartphones raised, to capture the moment for distant friends and social media feeds. "Mr. Johnson! Mr. Johnson!" reporters called from behind hastily established barriers. "How do you feel about what happened today?" Walter blinked against the flash of cameras, momentarily overwhelmed by the sensory assault. In that instant of hesitation, a tall Air Force officer in full-dress blues stepped forward from the crowd, creating a buffer between Walter and the media frenzy. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," the officer said, rendering a perfect salute. "General Robert Stevens, United States Air Force. I served under your command in Quang Tri Province, 1968. You won't remember me. I was a green lieutenant, barely out of the academy. But I've never forgotten you." Walter returned the salute automatically, military training overriding his surprise. "General Stevens, it's been a long time. 54 years, 2 months, and 17 days, Stevens replied with a smile. "And I still remember you telling me, Lieutenant, fear is fine as long as it doesn't stop you from doing what needs doing." Before Walter could respond, the crowd parted to reveal his daughter Amelia running toward him, tears streaming down her face. Behind her walked a young man in Air Force dress blues, Brandon Johnson, Walter's grandson, his face a mirror of emotions: pride, love, and barely contained anger at what his grandfather had endured. "Grandpa," Brandon said, embracing Walter, carefully. At 22, he stood 6 inches taller than his grandfather, but the family resemblance was unmistakable in the set of their jaws and the steady intelligence in their eyes. "They gave me special permission to leave the academy grounds when we heard what happened," Brandon explained. "The commandant himself authorized it." Walter cupped his grandson's face with weathered hands. "All this fuss for an old man who just wanted to attend your graduation." "You've never been just an old man, Grandpa," Brandon replied fiercely. "You're the reason I wear this uniform, the reason I understand what service really means." As the Johnson family reunion unfolded, the ESRO terminal grew even more crowded. Commercial flights continued operations around the media event, creating a surreal juxtaposition of ordinary travel routines against the extraordinary scene unfolding near Gate C-12. Victoria Hamilton, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines, approached with a small delegation of corporate executives. Her expression was solemn but determined as she faced not just Walter Johnson, but the assembled media. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite the background noise. "On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I want to publicly apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received today. There is no justification for what happened, and we take full responsibility." She paused, making eye contact with the bank of news cameras before continuing. "Effective immediately, Transcontinental Airlines is implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, creating a Veterans Advisory Council to guide our policies, and establishing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind." Victoria then presented Walter with an envelope. "This isn't compensation, Mr. Johnson, because what happened to you can't be compensated with material offerings. But we hope you'll accept this lifetime first-class pass for you and your family members as a small token of our respect for your service, both to our country and to this ongoing conversation about dignity and equality." Walter accepted the envelope with a gracious nod, understanding the symbolic importance of the moment even as he felt uncomfortable with the attention. Throughout his life, He had navigated a society that simultaneously praised his military service while questioning his humanity based on his skin color. This public acknowledgement of that contradiction felt both overdue and overwhelming. Meanwhile, in a lavish Connecticut estate, Harold Wilkins slammed down his phone after watching the live coverage. They're crucifying Heather in the media. This has gone beyond a simple employee termination. His wife Caroline peered over designer reading glasses. What did you expect, Harold? The video is damning. There's no spinning this. Harold paced the marble floors of their home theater, where multiple screens displayed different news channels all covering the same story. I've called in every favor I have. Put pressure on board members, advertisers, even that pilot Richardson's union rep. Nothing's working. In the adjacent room, Heather sat alone, scrolling through her social media feeds with growing horror. Former colleagues sharing stories of her past behavior, passengers recounting similar experiences on other flights, college acquaintances recalling racist comments she'd made years ago. Her carefully constructed life was unraveling post by post, tweet by tweet. Back in Colorado Springs, Walter found himself seated in a hastily arranged VIP lounge, surrounded by military officers, airline executives, and media representatives. The simple journey to see his grandson graduate had transformed into something far beyond his expectations or desires. "Mr. Johnson," a CNN reporter asked, microphone extended, "do you believe what happened to you today reflects a broader problem in American society?" Walter considered the question carefully, aware that his words would carry weight beyond this moment. "What happened today wasn't exceptional," he finally said. "It was just exceptionally visible. For many Americans who look like me, these indignities are so common, they barely register anymore. We swallow them, work around them, teach our children how to navigate them." He gestured toward his grandson, standing proudly in his uniform. "Brandon here will graduate tomorrow as an officer in the United States Air Force. He'll wear the same uniform, serve the same flag I did. My hope is that his service will be honored regardless of his appearance, and that he'll never have to fight for a seat he's rightfully earned." As Walter spoke, Captain Richardson stood quietly to the side, watching his old friend with undisguised admiration. In the decades since Vietnam, Richardson had built a comfortable life, respected career, suburban home, grandchildren who never questioned their place in society. Walter's journey had been different, marked by barriers and challenges that Richardson had never faced despite their shared military experience. "Captain Richardson," called out an MSNBC reporter, "you potentially risked your career today. What made you take such a dramatic stand?" Richardson stepped forward, his captain's uniform, still crisp despite the long day. "When I was 25 years old, Walter Johnson carried me through enemy territory for 3 miles with a shattered leg of his own. He didn't stop to consider the color of my skin or whether I deserved saving. He just did what was right at great personal cost." He paused, emotion momentarily overwhelming his professional demeanor. 47 years later, the least I could do was stop a plane to ensure he received the dignity he's earned 1,000 times over. As the impromptu press conference continued, Tyler Rodriguez stood in the background, still documenting the unfolding story. His original video had now exceeded 50 million views, and job offers from major media outlets filled his inbox. What had begun as a simple act of witness had transformed his life trajectory overnight. Sophia Cruz found herself similarly elevated, receiving praise from colleagues and being interviewed by Spanish-language networks about her role in alerting the captain. "I just did what I hope anyone would do," she repeated, uncomfortable with being labeled a hero for what felt like basic human decency. By evening, the story had dominated news cycles for nearly 12 hours. Political figures issued statements, celebrities shared the video with personal commentaries, and historians contextualized the incident within America's complex racial history. For Walter Johnson, however, the focus remained much narrower. As the media circus finally wound down, he sat quietly with his daughter and grandson in Amelia's modest hotel room, sharing a simple meal and preparing for tomorrow's graduation ceremony. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Grandpa," Brandon said softly. "If I'd been there." Walter reached across the table to squeeze his grandson's hand. then you'd have been upset and possibly endangered your own career. Sometimes the fight isn't about confrontation in the moment. It's about changing the systems that make such moments possible. Amelia watched her father and son with tears glistening in her eyes. The 3 generations of their family represented a timeline of American progress. Walter's generation fighting for basic rights and dignity, her own benefiting from those hard-won gains while facing more subtle barriers, and Brandon's inheriting both the progress and the unfinished work of equality. "Tomorrow is your day, son," Walter told Brandon firmly. "I didn't come all this way to steal your spotlight or turn your achievement into a referendum on American race relations. Tomorrow we celebrate you and your hard work." Brandon nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It's just hard to celebrate when I know what you went through just to be here." Walter's weathered face creased into a smile. "Every generation hopes the next one will have it better. That's the whole point. Your graduation tomorrow, that's my victory too." Night fell over Colorado Springs. Walter stood at the hotel window gazing toward the silhouetted mountains. He thought of Samuel and the others who hadn't made it home from Vietnam, of the long journey from that burning helicopter to this moment, of all the seats denied and battles fought along the way. Tomorrow his grandson would graduate, continuing a legacy of service despite the contradictions and complexities of that choice. Tomorrow represented everything Walter had fought for, not just in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the countless small moments of standing his ground in a country that too often questioned his right to exist in certain spaces. Sometimes dignity comes in dramatic moments caught on camera for millions to witness. But more often, it comes in quiet persistence, in refusing to surrender the ground you've rightfully earned, in boarding the plane again and again despite knowing the journey might bring humiliation alongside destination. Walter Johnson had never sought to be a symbol or a cause, but as he prepared for his grandson's graduation, he accepted that sometimes history chooses its witnesses rather than the other way around. Sometimes a seat on an airplane becomes about much more than transportation. It becomes about the fundamental question of who belongs where and who gets to decide. 6 months after the incident on Flight 247, Walter Johnson adjusted his tie in the mirror of his Washington, D.C. hotel room. At 72, he had never expected to become a regular visitor to the nation's capital, yet here he was preparing for his 4th congressional testimony. "You ready for this, Dad?" Amelia asked, handing him the typed statement he would deliver to the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. Walter nodded, folding the paper carefully into his inside jacket pocket. "Never thought I'd be advocating for legislation at my age. Always figured my fighting days were behind me." The Respect for Veterans Act had gained surprising bipartisan support in a typically divided Congress. The bill would strengthen protections against discrimination for service members and veterans, establish enhanced training requirements for transportation and hospitality industries, and create a streamlined reporting system for veterans experiencing discrimination. Walter's unexpected role as the face of this legislation had transformed his quiet retirement into something entirely different. The viral video of his humiliation and vindication on that flight had resonated far beyond the immediate news cycle, becoming a catalyst for a broader conversation about the intersection of race and military service in America. As Walter and Amelia rode the taxi toward Capitol Hill, his phone buzzed with a text message from Captain James Richardson. "Standing with you today, brother. In person and in spirit." The months since the incident had forged a renewed bond between the two Vietnam veterans. Richardson had taken early retirement from Transcontinental Airlines, using his separation package to help establish the Johnson-Richardson Foundation for Veterans Dignity, a nonprofit organization providing advocacy and support for veterans facing discrimination. "Captain Richardson is meeting us at the hearing?" Amelia asked, noticing her father's smile as he read the message. "Says he wouldn't miss it," Walter confirmed. "That man gave up a 30-year career to stand up for what's right." "He says you gave him a second chance at life in Vietnam," Amelia reminded him gently. "I'd say you're even now." The hearing room was already packed when they arrived. Representatives from veterans organizations filled the front rows. Behind them sat airline industry executives, including Victoria Hamilton, who had made Transcontinental Airlines a leader in inclusive practices following the incident. In the 6 months since that fateful flight, Victoria had overseen a complete transformation of the company's training protocols, hiring practices, and corporate culture. The airline now featured Walter's story prominently in its employee orientation, using the incident not as a cautionary tale, but as a launching point for meaningful discussion about implicit bias and dignity. Walter took his seat at the witness table, arranging his statement and water glass with methodical precision. As a history teacher for 30 years, he had always been comfortable speaking to classrooms of teenagers, but the national spotlight remained an unfamiliar and uncomfortable place. "The committee will come to order," announced Chairwoman Representative Eleanor Washington, gaveling the session to begin. "Today we continue our hearings on H.R. 4237, the Respect for Veterans Act, with testimony from Staff Sergeant Walter Johnson, United States Army retired, Medal of Honor recipient." Walter leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm honored to be here today, though I never sought nor expected this role." As Walter delivered his measured, thoughtful testimony about the discrimination he and other veterans of color had faced throughout their lives, the committee members listened with rare bipartisan attention. His words carried the weight of lived experience and the moral authority of one who had sacrificed for his country, only to be denied full citizenship in practice, if not in law. "The uniform I wore in Vietnam didn't shield me from discrimination when I returned home," Walter explained. "And 47 years later, the medals I earned didn't prevent me from being humiliated on that flight. This legislation isn't about special treatment. It's about ensuring that the respect we show for military service isn't conditioned on the race, gender, or background of the person who served." In the audience, James Richardson nodded in silent agreement. His own journey since the incident had involved considerable reflection on the privileges he had enjoyed throughout his life and career, privileges that his friend and savior Walter had been denied despite equal or greater service to their country. After the hearing concluded, Walter found himself surrounded by reporters and supporters in the hallway outside. Among them stood a face he didn't immediately recognize, a woman in her early 40s with a hesitant expression. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly when the crowd had thinned. "My name is Heather Wilkins." Walter stilled, studying the woman who had triggered the most publicized humiliation and subsequent vindication of his life. The 6 months since their encounter had clearly taken a toll. The polished, confident flight attendant had been replaced by someone whose eyes carried the weight of consequences. "Ms. Wilkins," Walter acknowledged with a slight nod. "This is unexpected." Heather twisted her hands nervously. "I've wanted to apologize to you personally for months, but my lawyers advised against it during the litigation with the airline." Following her termination, Heather's powerful family had indeed threatened lawsuits against transcontinental airlines, but the clear video evidence and public backlash had ultimately made such action untenable. Instead, Heather had faced her own journey of consequences: unemployment, public condemnation, and a profound reassessment of her values and behavior. "I've been working with a veterans organization in Connecticut," she continued when Walter didn't immediately respond. "Part of my community service requirement, but it's become much more than that. I've been learning about the experiences of veterans of color, listening to stories like yours." Walter regarded her thoughtfully. In his 30 years as a teacher, he had learned to recognize genuine growth versus performative contrition. Something in Heather's demeanor suggested the former. "The hardest lesson I've learned," Walter finally said, "is that justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration and growth. I hope you're finding your way toward both." Heather blinked rapidly, against unexpected tears. "I don't deserve your graciousness, Mr. Johnson." "Deserving has nothing to do with it," Walter replied simply. "We're all works in progress." Later that evening, Walter attended a small dinner hosted by the Johnson-Richardson Foundation. Among the guests was Tyler Rodriguez, whose split-second decision to document the incident had launched his career as a documentary filmmaker. His feature, First Class Citizen, about Walter's life and the broader issues of race and military service, had recently won awards at 3 film festivals. "Your grandfather would be proud," James Richardson told Brandon Johnson, who had received his first promotion since graduating from the Air Force Academy. Following in his footsteps, but hopefully facing fewer barriers, Brandon, resplendent in his dress uniform, shook his head slightly. I'm not sure anyone could truly follow in his footsteps. I'm just trying to honor his legacy by serving with the same integrity. Claire Donovan approached their table, representing her company's foundation, which had become a major donor to veterans' causes following her experience on Flight 247. Mr. Johnson, the corporate diversity initiative we launched based on your story has now been adopted by 17 Fortune 500 companies. Walter accepted the news with characteristic humility. Change happens when people with power and privilege recognize injustice and take action. You could have remained a silent bystander that day. You chose differently. Across town, in the boardroom of Transcontinental Airlines, Victoria Hamilton presented the quarterly results to her executive team. Our customer satisfaction metrics have increased 27% since implementing the new training protocols, she reported. Employee retention is up, complaints are down, and we've received industry recognition for our diversity initiatives. All because of one incident? Questioned a skeptical board member. No, Victoria corrected firmly. All because we chose to learn from one incident rather than dismiss it. All because we recognized that what happened to Walter Johnson wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of deeper issues we needed to address systemically. Back at the foundation dinner, Walter found a quiet moment alone with Barbara Williams, the elderly white woman who had been one of the first passengers to speak up during the confrontation. In the months since, they had developed an unexpected friendship, even partnering on educational initiatives about civil rights history. Did you ever imagine back in those Freedom Rider days that you'd still be fighting these battles in your 70s? Walter asked her. Barbara's laugh lines deepened around her eyes. I hoped not, certainly. But the arc of history is long. As Dr. King reminded us, we bend it as we can, when we can, where we can. The dinner concluded with the announcement that the foundation would be funding scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation, pilots, engineers, executives, to help transform the industry from within. As Walter prepared to return home the following day, he stood at his hotel window overlooking the monuments and memorials that defined Washington's skyline. The Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, tributes to imperfect men whose words about equality and justice had always existed in tension with the reality of American life. His phone rang, displaying Brandon's number. Everything okay, grandson? Walter answered. Just wanted to tell you I got my flight assignment, Brandon replied, excitement evident in his voice. I'll be piloting C-17s out of Dover next month. Walter closed his eyes, emotion welling unexpectedly. His grandson would fly massive transport aircraft for the same country that had once questioned Walter's right to sit in a first-class seat. Progress, imperfect, but real. I'm proud of you, son, Walter said, his voice thick with feeling. So proud. After ending the call, Walter picked up the framed photograph that now traveled with him everywhere. A picture taken moments after. Flight 247 had landed in Colorado Springs 6 months earlier. Walter Johnson and James Richardson in the center, surrounded by military personnel of all ages, races, and genders, all rendering salutes to the elderly black veteran who had needed to fight one more battle for dignity long after his war had officially ended. The following morning, Walter boarded his flight home. As he approached the gate, the airline staff recognized him immediately. Thank you for your service, Mr. Johnson, the young black gate agent said with genuine respect. Walter nodded, accepting the gratitude with quiet dignity, as he had hundreds of times since becoming a reluctant public figure. When he reached his seat in first class, a seat he had purchased himself despite numerous offers of free tickets, he settled in with the comfortable familiarity of a traveler who finally felt entitled to the space he occupied. The flight attendant, a young woman with a bright smile, approached. Mr. Johnson, it's an honor to serve you today. Is there anything I can get you before takeoff? Just water, thank you, he replied, the exchange remarkable only in its ordinariness, the simple respect that should have been his all along. As the plane lifted off, Walter gazed out the window at the sprawling Capitol below, thinking of all the battles fought on that ground for the soul and conscience of America. His own contribution was just one thread in a tapestry woven by millions of hands across generations. The flight attendant returned with his water, placing it carefully on his tray table. "My grandfather served in Vietnam too," she said. "He told me your story inspired him to finally start talking about his experiences." Walter smiled. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight with ourselves. To speak up, to stand firm, to keep going when dignity is denied. 6 months earlier, he had boarded a flight as a reluctant traveler, an old man simply trying to reach his grandson's graduation. Today he flew as something more. A symbol, yes, but more importantly, a man who had helped bend the long arc of history just a little more toward justice. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Walter closed his eyes, thinking of Samuel and the others who hadn't returned from Vietnam. "Mission accomplished, brothers," he whispered to himself. Not the mission they had been assigned in that distant jungle, but the longer, harder mission of making America live up to its promises for all its citizens. The true measure of progress, Walter had come to believe, wasn't in grand gestures or viral videos. It was in the mundane moments, being served a glass of water without hesitation, occupying space without justification, existing without explanation or apology. In the end, the most revolutionary act had been the simplest, claiming the seat he had rightfully earned and refusing to be moved. What moment in this story touched you the most? Was it Walter's quiet dignity, Captain Richardson's courageous stand, or perhaps the unexpected transformations of characters like Claire and Heather? Comment below to share your thoughts. If you believe more stories about everyday heroes standing up against discrimination need to be told, please like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that one person's courage can create lasting change. Thank you for joining us for this journey, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to move from your rightful place in the world. Walter Johnson's journey teaches us that dignity cannot be surrendered, even when facing blatant discrimination. His story reminds us that justice often requires both personal courage and collective action. While Walter maintained his composure, it took Tyler's documentation, Barbara's outspoken support, and Captain Richardson's dramatic intervention to transform a moment of injustice into accountability. The story illustrates how racism persists in subtle and overt forms, despite decades of progress. Walter's military service, even his Medal of Honor, didn't shield him from humiliation based solely on his appearance. Yet the aftermath demonstrates how confronting discrimination can lead to meaningful systemic change. Perhaps most powerful is the revelation that everyone plays a role in either perpetuating or dismantling inequality. Claire's initial silence, Sophia's hesitant intervention, and Richardson's decisive action show the spectrum of responses available when witnessing injustice. The ripple effects, from corporate policy changes to legislative action, prove that individual moments of courage can transform institutions. Walter's final wisdom reminds us that true progress isn't measured in grand gestures, but in everyday dignity, being served without hesitation, occupying space without justification, existing without apology. Has a moment of discrimination or injustice ever unfolded before your eyes? What did you do or wish you had done? Share your experience in the comments below. If Walter's quiet dignity and unwavering resolve inspired you, give this video a thumbs up to help others find this important story. We all face moments where we must choose between comfortable silence and necessary action. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of everyday heroes who stand against racism and discrimination, proving that one person's courage can create lasting change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to surrender your rightful place in the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Walter's story. And remember, dignity delayed is not dignity denied.